Welcome to Go-to-Market Navigator by Fin Capital, our ongoing series where we break down the essential components of nailing the right go-to-market strategy. Today, I'm joined by John Smith and Robert Dunn from HI Executive Consulting, a global executive search firm focused on hiring board, CEO, and senior level executives. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Gentlemen, I'm so excited to have you with us today. One of the most important things that a founder or CEO can do is hire the right people. And you advise companies on this day and night. And so given the fact that this is a go-to-market series, we want to focus today on hiring the right sales leadership. And with that, why don't you both introduce yourselves and also the firm?
Yes, I'll let John go first.
Sure. So, John Smith, I'm one of the partners in the software and technology practice at HIEC. I've been doing this for close on 20 years now through combination of both software and fintech businesses ranging from the large Fortune 500s to the last decade or so focused primarily on investor-backed businesses.
And I'm Robert Dunn. I'm a partner in the software and technology practice at HIC. So I cover essentially startups. They can be pre-revenue, early revenue, scaling all the way up to 100 million. In the software and technology practice, I can cover any position as long as it's in software and technology. HIEC is a global international search firm. It's been around for a dozen years. We cover everything from the UK, Europe. We covered North America. So we're worldwide, able to help pretty much any type of company, private, scaling, and public companies.
Great. And you guys
should add, we've got so you're going to add this as a transatlantic perspective here with myself being in London and Rob from Denver.
Wonderful. And you guys have been great partners to some of our portfolio companies. So always excited to collaborate. As you both know, we're full lifecycle investors. So we invest from pre-seed all the way up to growth equity. And one of the questions that we get from some of our younger and more kind of nascent portfolio companies is, when is the right time to hire your first salesperson? When is the right time to transition from more of a kind of founder-led sales motion to one where you actually have experts come in and do your prospecting and closing?
Absolutely. Great question. And I've seen this done wrong many times. I would say in a nutshell, it's when the founder has mastered the sales motion and the value proposition and can no longer cover it. But there's two factors on this, or dynamics, that I don't think are discussed enough, or founders aren't told enough that might guide them. One is, what is the customer segment you're going after? For example, if you're oriented towards enterprise, that almost certainly is going to be a more complex sales cycle, more personas. The value proposition is going to be more complex, which means it's probably going to take you longer to get to that point. Don't hand that off too soon. The second big factor that I do not hear discussed enough is the technology continuum versus discontinuum. And let me explain what I mean by that. Take Pure Storage. Pure Storage was new technology in an existing space. What that means is the value proposition is already largely understood, as is the sales motion. So a company like Pure Storage will be able to load up on early sales hires more quickly. In fact, they know who to go hire from, EMC, et cetera. But let's say you're in a new technology in a new space. It's going to take you longer. Do not hand that off too soon to your first sales hire, because it's probably going to take longer to get the value proposition right, who you're selling to, and the sales motion. Hopefully that's helpful.
I think you're absolutely right, Rob. You can sometimes rush to hire someone to hand this off to, but I also think there's really rich, deep learnings for the founder to hear those conversations, right? I mean, the product is their baby, and sometimes the scrutiny you get from a serious enterprise buyer, it might not always be what you want to hear, but it's rich feedback for an early stage company.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. That point that you guys made about selling into kind of a new nascent industry. Oftentimes, salespeople get hired based on their networks, based on what deals they've closed in the past. And when you're selling in a completely new product, market, segment, that no longer, is as valuable, right? And so you need to iterate on what the value prop is, the messaging and the education for the customer. So totally resonates. I think, on the other side of the spectrum, The question is, well, when do I hire like a VP of sales? I've got some individual contributors, they're killing it, but like, how do I scale this function?
Absolutely. The first thing I would say is you really want to have at least 2 sales reps who are successful, right? It doesn't have to necessarily be more than that, but you don't want to go, if you started with sales reps, because there are some scenarios where your VP of sales is your first sales rep,
Yeah.
possibly, okay? But let's say you hired 1 or 2 reps and the founder was kind of overseeing them. If you feel like, I think we kind of got this a little bit, now you can bring in your VP of sales and they can start building on it. But I have seen many times where the VP of sales is brought in too early. No one's figured this out yet. There hasn't been a successful handoff from the founder to any reps. And somehow, and they're told this, if you go hire a VP of sales, this will all be figured out. That's not necessarily the case. Make sure you kind of feel like, gosh, at least we have 2 data points that we kind of know what we're doing, and now we can expand, and we need that sales leadership.
Yeah, I think it's being able to identify those patterns of success in
Yeah.
the early team, and then being able to, you're asking the VP to productize those success to scale it.
100% productizing. Couldn't agree more. Putting together the operational frameworks, the playbooks, the demo scripts and everything. So totally resonates. Terms like oftentimes the term VP of sales is interchangeably used with chief revenue officer.
Yes.
2 different things. Please tell us.
Yes. Okay. I'm so glad you asked this question. And I should say first, make sure, please make sure you know what you want in your VP of sales as much as you can figure that out. For example, do you want a player coach? If you're hiring them on early on, is this someone who maybe is actively selling also, along with a very small set of sales reps? So try to get some clarity on that. I would say the two of the first differences that come up to my mind is scope of responsibility and immediacy of management. If you're hiring a VP, if you're hiring the right VP of sales at an earlier stage, they are directly managing the sales reps. They're probably directly managing 1 or 2 sales engineers. They're probably directly managing 1 CS person. And their scope is really the core sales function. Okay. They love that. Once you get the CROs, they don't necessarily love that. The CRO is going to be thinking things through. Who do I hire in to oversee all of customer success? Who do I hire to oversee the sales engineering process? Where do I start building out regional sales manager? So they're not going to be as managing that function as directly, and their scope of responsibility starts getting bigger. The other thing, and this is, you can kind of cheat using this, but you got to be careful. It's sort of the stage of the financing and the revenue scale. So I would typically see a CRO not hired before Series B and not hired before 10 million in ARR. And that doesn't mean it never happens, but you want there to be more revenue momentum. It's more scaling, more sophistication, more capital that's backing the company. The other thing is the CRO should be thinking long-term go-to-market strategy. You don't necessarily expect that from a VP of sales. The VP of sales needs to get the fundamentals right, the nuts and bolts, the blocking and tackling, because if you don't get that right, the long-term go-to-market strategy won't really matter. And the last thing I would add in there is the difference in the build. The VP of sales is probably going to be doing things like building the initial sales team, or maybe it goes from 2 to 10. The CRO, again, is thinking through overall the entire, often even marketing, the entire go-to-market structure. So they're thinking much more broadly. They also should have a richer grasp of the revenue function. Again, the VP of sales is like, are we closing deals, right? How are the mechanics going? The CRO needs to be thinking through things like, okay, where's the next revenue stream from? How does channel fit into this? What are market segments that are close by that we can expand into? Maybe that's going from enterprise to mid-market, or US to, Europe and the UK. They need to be thinking about that more broadly.
how do you advise companies who may have sales leadership in place, who they think are great, they're high performing, they understand the business, they're at an inflection point, they've raised a certain amount, they're at a Series C, their investors are really pressuring them to think about how to build kind of effectively a pre-IPO business. Like, let's think long term, let's think big. Sometimes you don't know if you should hire from within or get, someone from the outside. And so how does the CEO think through this? I can only imagine what a challenge this must be when you have people who you're really fond of, who you think are great, but you're also thinking about what your investors want and also what you'll need 5, 10 years from now.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it is rather complicated. Again, I think the founder needs to have as much clarity of what do we want out of this hire. I think sometimes they expect kind of magic to come from the CRO, for example. Oh, wow, the CRO will be great. I would again say think through some of the profile of that CRO. Just because they were successful in one company, really ask yourself again, were they selling, if your technology startup is new technology in new space and they've been successful in new technology in existing space, be really, really careful, right? That probably won't work. If they were really successful selling into mid-market, but for the next 2 years, your market is enterprise, don't do that. If, however, you see someone from the outside that feels like they have those skill sets, then you ask yourself, what would we want this person to do in a sense differently that we believe they could do that our current director of sales, a VP of sales probably couldn't do? So maybe your current director of sales or VP of sales has no experience building out channels. I mean, maybe they can do it, but that's tough. Maybe they have no experience with international expansion. That might be tough. So I think if you can see a couple of categories that you really believe this person can help the company with, and there's a good fit with sort of the customer segment and that technology continuum, discontinuum, you might want to do it. I've seen very few situations where the original person went all the way. I mean, Degman at Snowflake is an exception, right? Director of sales went all the way through, is still there, I believe, a CRO. But generally they have a tough time with these major expansions in geography, distribution channels, customer segments. You're probably going to have to get someone out. But again, if you think things are going to be largely the same for the next year or two, man, see if this person, let them go as far as they can.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think if IPO readiness is a real driver, then you might want to think of someone who's used to delivering the revenue number to the quarterly cycle to the street, because there's a lot of expectation on privately owned business, but someone who knows what that public reporting cycle looks like ahead of time can be very useful.
John, I want to get your thoughts on this. So, particularly some of our later stage companies who are expanding into new regions, how should they think about hiring sales leadership? Should they hire someone in the net new region? Does that person need to have an existing relationship with the company and is simply transplanting? Like, what are you seeing?
If I were going to suggest a template for it, I think where possible, I would initially use a team from within. So if you've got people from early joiners at the HQ who you can put together on with a pod, who are interested in an international assignment, and send a seller, an SE, a support person as a pod of 3 or 4 people, and get them to land in a new region, then it carries some of that muscle memory, the DNA, the know-how of the business into the region. So I think that's probably step 1. Step 2, I think, is to leverage who you know, customers that you work with in your local market who are international. You use them to help get a springboard into additional territories. Same is true with partners. Same is true with your investors. Can help with that. So if you can lay the ground with that initial pod of 3 or 4, I think that's probably the best way to get started, and then you can figure out how you want to set about building and hiring in the region.
Let's say you've only done domestic sales, and maybe you're going from 5 to 10. So you're not quite sure what it really looks like yet to expand into Europe. you can kind of cheat a little bit, for example, and make sure you've got a strong sales rep on the East Coast who can drop into, let's say, the UK, right? It's not that hard. Start testing the waters. Is our product, is it going to get traction there? And if you start seeing some of that, then you sort of can go, okay, now we think we actually want to get a sales rep or two or a little pod in London. And then once you're in London, well, now you can start covering not just the UK and Ireland, but now you're in proximity, to the continent. I don't know that you have to do this massive jump all at once. See, can you get closer somehow in a reasonable way to cover it? I've been at, two of the technology companies I've been in. That's what we did. We set up strong sales leadership in the East Coast, and they were expected, as things took off, they would initially cover just the UK. And as that started going, okay, now we know we'll put someone there, build out further in the UK, and then start tackling Europe.
Yeah.
And I know this conversation's focused on go-to-market, but you also need to think hard about the product implications of international expansion and make sure you're ready. I think particularly when I see US companies coming to Europe, remember in the US, you're coming from one market where you're largely used to one language, one currency, one regulatory environment. You come to Europe, then you're dealing with many languages, currencies, regulatory environments, and you've got to think through what does that mean from a product perspective? Are you ready to sell in a new region?
Yeah, that's super rich advice. Very much appreciate that. And then how would you advise companies to think about looking elsewhere and utilizing a function like yours, right? An external search firm who can help them find the right candidates. When is the right time to do that? And how do you even go about doing that?
I think you want to ask yourself, do we even have someone in our network that we could get ourselves? And sometimes you do. And if you do, God bless you, go with that, right? But a lot of times you don't, or you might have a person or two, but frankly, you don't really know how to evaluate them. You've got one or two persons, and you'd like to really have a pool of people so that you can evaluate them against other potential candidates. You may still possibly go with that one or two, that person that was in your network, but you'll feel better if you're working with a search firm that's showing you a lot of good candidates and you're going through a process. That's the other thing. Remember, a search firm is not only helping show you candidates, they're helping you think through things such as, what should the interview cycle look like? Who all should interview? Have you thought through compensation? How does this person fit into the existing org structure? So there's a lot of help you can get that is on top of the candidate, seeing candidates themselves. As far as maybe which search firm you go with, I would bring up a few things such as, do they tend to work at the stage and scale you were in, right? There's some great search firms that could, they'll place a CRO for companies at 200 million ARR. If you're at 5 million or 10 million, I don't know that they'll be able to help you as much, right? Mm-hmm. Make sure they have a sense of your technology space, at least relatively. Again, being silly, if someone primarily places heads of revenue in consumer products and you're hardcore B2B infrastructure technology, that's probably not going to work that well either. Here's something that's not talked about enough that I would really encourage any portfolio company to dig into a little bit. How will the search firm staff the team? Right? A lot of times, search firms, you will meet the heavy, the partner, and it looks great. And you start to search and you quickly realize they haven't staffed it adequately with research people. And frankly, the partner just shows up to the once a week meeting and that's it. So ask questions like, hey, can you tell me how this will be staffed? Who will be helping? And then ask the partner, ask them point blank, what will your involvement be in this search? I always make sure, I'm sure John does too, I am in the interview cycle. I am qualifying every candidate myself in detail. Don't just hand it off to someone. Double check on that. Here's the last thing I'd say, and look, this may matter to some of your portfolio companies, some startups, and it may not. Do you want an operational lens? Right? Do you want an operational lens? Do you want someone who has actually spent some time in operations in a startup. One of the things I try to bring to searches myself is 30 years of operational experience, while also pulling in, because we build entire teams, people who have 5, 10, 20 years of search experience. I think that's a win-win. Otherwise, what can happen sometimes is you choose a search firm and they basically go through the same motions. And if they don't find someone that fits, they're stuck, because they can't go to a depth where they really richly understand what you're trying to do. It's kind of similar to a real estate agent that goes, oh, you want a 4-bedroom house with 2 bathrooms in this school district, and they show you 10 of those, but none of those work for you, and then they're stuck because that's as deep as they can go. So, ask yourself, be picky, ask questions. Don't feel like just because someone said go with this one or they're great. No, it's your company. If you make the wrong, and I've seen this personally, you make the wrong VP of sales hire or the wrong CRO hire, you will lose 1 to 1.5 years of your progress. And you may never be the same company. So it's your company. Feel comfortable asking some hard questions and dig in some. Make sure you feel comfortable with the search firm you're going to choose.
Yeah, I think the personal chemistry is super important as well. I think we do a lot of work with founders and in some cases using search for the first time. And I think the chemistry and the trust between you has got to be there. So some of it is the gut feel and the trust, the chemistry fit, but built on all those, the great rational things that Rob highlighted.
Yeah. Here's a tactical question, but how long should you expect a search to last?
Oh,
It's nuanced.
I'm so glad you asked that, because I've many times seen unrealistic expectations, especially from founders or first-time CEOs. Look, it takes time to just turn it on, and then you don't want to make the wrong hire. You should plan at least 3 months, and it could go 6 months. And so, in fact, I was just on a call this week, and someone's like, "Oh, we need to go, and we need this." We're like, "Great. And when do you want this person in the saddle?" In 6 weeks. I'm like, "You needed to start this a month ago, right?" So kind of back into it and look, you don't like that answer, but you should budget 3 to 6 months. And of course, that will guide you into when you should start this process. You can't just start it tomorrow and then boom, you've got the person hired.
So this is the last question. It's two-pronged. What's the biggest mistake that founders do in the hiring process? And what are some mistakes that you've made in the process?
Oh, that's a good one. That's fair. Now we're getting real. Okay.
Yeah.
So let me start with the easier one. Mistakes I've seen founders make. One, calibrating the position wrong, right? And often, Stephanie, wrong going too high. There's this sometimes sense like if I go higher, I'll get a CRO instead of VP of sales, that'll just make it work better. And that's not necessarily the case. You may get someone who frankly doesn't want to do the role that you're hiring into. That's one. The second, this one kind of surprises me, but not as much anymore. Not being clear who all's got to be involved. For example, some investors really want to be involved. I mean, they really do. Some, in fact, have veto rights. And I've seen more than once, we get to the end of the process, the founder, the team's ready to go hire this person. And then they check with one of the board members, one of the investors, and they're like, hey, we're about to hire. Hey, I haven't talked to him. Oh my God. They talk to him and like, you're not hiring this person. Sometimes months of work vanishes, gone. It's a disaster. Make sure you know who wants to be. Talk to your investors. Talk to your board members. Hey, we know we need to start this process of hiring the VP of sales. Do you want to be involved? How much do you want to be involved? Do you want to be on the calls? Do you want a final say on the hire? Ask that question. It's a little uncomfortable, but you need to know who has a veto right and who doesn't, or you will just spend lots of times, frustrate yourself, frustrate candidates. And by the way, you'll get a little bit of a bad name out in the marketplace because you'll look silly. So that's some of the mistakes I've seen made. As far as mistakes I've made, I myself have not always gauged clearly the sentiments, particularly of investors, right? What is their criteria? Sometimes their criteria for the hire is not what the company's telling me. That's a real unpleasant surprise. So I've tried to get better. Sometimes it's a little awkward because, again, a very strong-minded founder, you have to be almost to start in a company from scratch. They've got a picture in their mind. It's not necessarily the same as the investors. I say another mistake I've made is I haven't sometimes challenged the investors enough. Like, look, if you want to be in this, you need to be in this. You need to have someone from your team, if it's not you, someone from your fund on these calls, because otherwise you're going to be surprised and we all lose. So I would say that's two of the bigger mistakes I've personally made.
John?
Yeah, well, I maybe add a little to one of your points in terms of making sure you know who the stakeholders are in the process, but almost from another direction, into having a clearly defined view of who you want involved. Because there's sometimes you get search creep in terms of you ask more and more opinions. Like, and you ask enough people, sooner or later you're going to get a dissenting voice somewhere. So have a really clear view of who's on the committee, who's on the panel for this, and stay true to that. I think is one mistake I've seen. In terms of mistakes we've made and learned from over the years, I think it's maybe more of a theme is don't assume too much from the search itself. So we all have our prejudices, right? You hear company name X and you assume there can't possibly be anybody in that company. Whereas actually, you've got to dig, you've got to look, you've got to talk to them, you've got to test it and just see if the hypothesis is right. Because even in companies, you might instinctively think, my next CRO is not coming from company X. Actually, you talk to them, you find things out that could bring them into the frame.
Yeah, that's a great one. I hadn't thought about that last one. And you guys mentioned something that I think is super valuable, which is involving your founders. And we've spent some time together and thinking about specific roles and just being able to bring the perspective of how the company, from a performance perspective, is benchmarked across the rest of the portfolio and kind of what we see as the gaps, and where we think that sales leadership could help fill those, I think is really important. So couldn't agree more, having that kind of collaboration if you're in a situation where you have a very value-added investor. But I think that's pretty much all I had for today. I really appreciate the candid responses, the feedback, the knowledge base. As you can imagine, this is a new experience for a lot of founders, and having someone who can help them navigate this process is always valuable. So very much appreciate both of your time.
Oh, our pleasure, Stephanie. Thanks for having us.
Great. Thank you so much.